Good morning, Buck Bookers. It is I, the only hero we have left in this blighted world, Buck, and I would like to welcome you back to another thrilling episode of Buck's Books. So, if you were young, poor, and mentally ill in the late 90s and early 2000s, you probably had no choice but to become punk. And if you were punk, either during its initial iteration in the 80s or during the revival of the early 2000s, you are aware of Operation Ivy. Now, Operation Ivy was sort of like the seminal ska punk band, right? And probably still the best. I mean, an argument can be made for like Streetlight or whatever, but there's just no beating the classics. And Operation Ivy, every time they got big, every time they started to accrue too much of an audience, they decided that it was not punk to get popular. It was not punk to be recognized and start to get paid for what they were doing, because it was about the music. The song Journey to the End of East Bay is sort of about that. But it's by Rancid, though, which is what Op Ivy became. So every time they started to accrue this kind of recognition, Operation Ivy broke up. Right? They sabotaged themselves. And I will be doing the same thing today by reviewing Dune by Frank Herbert. So, Buck, how are you going to sabotage things? By reviewing Dune. Everybody loves Dune. Did you hate Dune? That's the interesting part. I didn't hate Dune. I liked Dune. The second time. I read Dune twice. The first time, I tried to read it in high school because it's this classic sci-fi situation. And I didn't have the attention span, and I didn't care. And I probably didn't have like the context to understand what Frank Herbert was kind of pushing at the time either. So, I didn't like the first time. Then the second time, that's more recently. Second time I read it is because all of the Dune movies came out. So I said, okay, obviously I'm going to read the books before I see the movie. Technically I read the books, but I don't remember anything from the books because I didn't pay attention to the books. I was just dragging my feet through them. So, I dragged my feet through the first one, and one and done. It was like 800 pages. And there are so many Dunes. I don't know how many Dunes there are. I feel like somewhere between 5 and 14, but I barely made it through the first one at that time, so I certainly wasn't going to keep going. There's so many books to read. Did you ever notice how many books there are to read? So, instead, I decided to reread the first Dune, and it was excellent. It was really good. However, there is an elephant in the room that we need to address, and I'm going to get there organically. I don't want to start with the elephant. So if you'll just excuse, this is going somewhere. So our boy Paul Euphrates, he is, I know that's not his name, I'm going to call him it anyway. Paul Euphrates is the chosen one. He was born into this magical royal family that gives him special powers because of his blood, right? We're all on board with that so far. That's a fact. That's part of the plot of Dune. This world in which Paul Euphrates is coming of age has these arranged marriages, and they're within an arbitrary eugenic system. The great matrons within this world are highly respected because of their mastery of very subtle social cues. But it is of the utmost importance that we subvert all of the established hierarchies within our world, because the wives must become mere concubines, and the concubines, they must be elevated to wives. Alright, so we got all this going on, and then so this is the backdrop, and then we return to our special-blooded protagonist, and he is just naturally amazing at everything. Sort of Gary Sue, right? There's nothing he is confronted with that he doesn't immediately and effortlessly master. It's sort of a power fantasy. Paul Euphrates cannot be stopped. And the reason for that is because he is half witch and half nerd. Now, up until this point, no one had ever been half witch and half nerd before. There were witches, and there were nerds, but there was never a half nerd. So now we have someone who is simultaneously half witch and half nerd. This is like accidentally genetically engineering a centaur for the first time. This is actually more like the myth of the Minotaur, come to think of it. Like there's an established myth for this. So they took him to the haunted pain box, and they said, put your hand in the haunted pain box. And he did, and he was able to survive more haunted pain than anyone else, any other witch. I don't think nerds ever had to put their hands in the haunted pain box. It's been a while since I read this. I'll tell you how long it's been since I read this. I read this in March, which is when the movies came out. Yeah, quick aside. I read the book in order to be prepared to watch the movies, and then I didn't watch the movies. So I hear the movies are good from my own comment section, which is, it's really popping off now. This is the social event of the season. My YouTube comment section. The Bucktronauts, the Buck Bookers, they're really, and it is because of that conversation that I'm reviewing this. So pay heed, Buck Bookers. If you want to see a book reviewed, summarized, blasted, or gassed up, just mention it. Mention it in the comments. Start a conversation about it. You don't even need to request it. You can just put it in my head, and there's a decent chance I'll have read it, honestly. I told you about my Goodreads. We're 1,200 deep now. So statistically, if it's a popular book, I might have read it. And I'll just start thinking about it and be like, yeah, I'm going to do that one next. It's content. It's unlimited content. It's content factory, right? So let's get back to our boy Paul Euphrates. Paul Euphrates, half witch, half nerd, haunted pain box, boom, puts his hand in the haunted pain box, and he's just capable of surviving as much haunted pain as you got. Doesn't even bother him. Could he be the chosen one? The only way to know for sure if Paul Euphrates is the chosen one is to subject him to tests. And test him they did. So if you take the book, right, the original Dune, and open it to just any random spot in the book, within probably 3 paragraphs, you will find Paul Euphrates being subjected to a test. The entire book is just the labors of Paul Euphrates, test after test after test. And the thing is, you can't miss. Dude cannot fail. Paul Euphrates just keeps knocking him clean out of the park. Can't stop. It's because of his special blood. It's because he's half witch, half nerd. He's unstoppable. He must be the chosen one. Paul can pass all the tests because of his royal magic witch nerd blood, and because of just some certain je ne sais quoi about his personality. So, by now, those of you well-versed in books in general may be noticing a sort of pattern. And the pattern is that everything I have described thus far fits the mold of every smutty fantasy book where they marry into some sort of magical fairy court and are forced to engage in court intrigue. Dune is chicklit, dude. Dune is chicklit. I'm sorry. And the reason that this revelation is going to damage me personally so much is because 80% of book readers right now are female. 80% of the paper media market is propped up by women buying books. So by speaking disparagingly of chick lit, that's not great for whoever's here wondering about books, trying to engage about books. And I'm not being disparaging. I'm calling it as I see it. The truth is, we have a duty to the truth. And then, obviously, Dune is this gritty, manly, hard sci-fi. All of the dudes are gonna hear this, and they're gonna be outraged. But if it doesn't fit, you must acquit, my guy. Look at the situation. You have to look. We ran down. Everything matches exactly. If there's a formula for writing like popular fairy court romantasy right now, this is it. Dune was its inception. And it's so on the nose with it that it's almost Harry Potter, man. I never read A Court of Thorns and Roses, but Dune is like a planet of sand and Muslims. Everything matches, right? Except for one thing. There's one thing that prevents Dune from being your girlfriend's favorite book, and that is the fact that there is no smut in it whatsoever. So, as we know, those books, the fairy court intrigue books, are vehicles for the smut, and there's something of a double standard there, because there's an excellent book on, I know this is a demonetized word, so I'm going to go ahead and call it cornography. To try to juke the censors there, to juke YouTube. When I was a little kid, I always dreamed of trying to figure out how to juke the censors. You know, when I was going to grow up and have a TV show like What Would You Do with Mark Summers. And I would spend a lot of time and emotional energy trying to figure out how I would get around the censorship bureau. So it's nice to be able to make that a reality now in my advanced age. I read this fantastic book called A Billion Wicked Thoughts, and it talks about sort of our current cultural use of cornography and how it works across the biological sex divide, right? So men, obviously visual creatures, are more compelled to the use of cornography, which over time, especially with the super stimulus that it exists as now, because they're not like skin rags anymore, you know, they're not like nudie mags. You're looking at like these blistering high definition things that they hadn't even, like, the acts that they hadn't even invented 40 years ago, and kids are being exposed to them when they're like 11 as soon as they get like unsupervised internet. So it talks about the impact of that on the generation. But it also talks about how, because of the differences in sort of feminine arousal, that they are not as visually motivated. Just looking doesn't do it for them. They by and large, all other things equal, there's this engagement that takes place cerebrally. You know, you gotta connect on an emotional and intellectual almost level, and that is why the sort of feminine analog for cornography is smutty fantasy books. They work the same way, and they do the same basic things to the brain, where they distort the expectations of either person, you know, either side of this divide. Yeah. So cornography, what you're looking at, that's not real life, man. That's not how it works. You know, when you're in flagrante delicto, that's not. It'll fall apart eventually. Whereas the same is true of these romantasy novels. But we are each drawn to them because they're super stimuli that it's like a Dorito, man. It's there to press the exact buttons in our brain, even though it's not providing anything nourishing or fulfilling. I'm, again, trying not to alienate my entire potential audience. I'm just putting out this book, A Billion Wicked Thoughts. Excellent if you're interested in any of that. It is a science book, kind of dry. I bring it up once again to draw attention back to Dune, because Dune has all of the component parts of one of these smutty books except the smut. But if you like get a file of Dune, right, like a Word document, just cut and paste it to a Word document, and then you do find and replace, and you change all instances of the words fat and gross to the word chiseled, and then you just randomly insert 3 erotic fanfic smut scenes at any point in the text, and like I'm sure they exist since the release of Dune, and how they cast that very pretty boy as Paul Euphrates, Timothy Bechamel, I don't know, but you can definitely find him and just slap it in there, and then you read it through, and you have made this is you know what you did. So you heard it here first, folks. The only thing that's actually preventing Dune from being like the favorite book of your girlfriend's book club is that the turgid, throbbing length of him only really applies to like Shai Hulud's segmentation. And if this had been written by one of those authors, Vladimir Harkonnen would have had washboard abs and probably not been a pederast. Unfortunately, even knowing all that, I had no choice but to give the book 4 stars because it's really good. The story's really good. So, I guess what I'm saying is don't judge a book by its genre. Just because it is something that I am casually contemptuous of doesn't mean that it's necessarily bad. You know, like I read the first of the 50 Shades books. That was bad. That was actually bad. They were mean to each other. So much name calling. But it was a bad book. It was poorly written. But that's not to denigrate the actual smutty books that are good out there. Now, it's not really my genre, so I can't speak too widely and give you like smutty chick-lit recommendations, because the genre that I tend to read, and this is just the other half of the same divide, which is, this is me showing my hand, you know, I'm not trying to be superior here. I am just as guilty as you are, ladies. And what I am guilty of is reading the same Viking novel in different iterations over and over again since 2005. And it's always about a grizzled Viking war chief, and he has been out of the game for years because of the incident. But now it's time to get the band back together, the gang, the companymen, to gather the companymen back together for one more heist or one more war. And then at some point they upset a god of some kind, and it just keeps escalating. There is likely going to be a dungeon. There is 100% going to be a shield wall. Every single book by Bernard Cornwell, they're all excellent. They're all 5-star books, and they are all this story. The Saxon stories are all this story, but then also the King Arthur Warlord Chronicles. The Warlord Chronicles are also this story, even though they take place in early England and King Arthur was like British. It's still just about being a grizzled Viking. So this is my guilty pleasure. This is my literary sin. I read that book over and over and over again. That's it for Dune. If you haven't read Dune, you should read Dune. If you watched the movie and liked what you saw, I heard that the movie was fairly faithful to the book, so you should still probably read Dune. If you like smut, you should read Dune and just like fill in some blanks. If you don't like smut, you should read Dune to see what smut is like, because it might turn out that you do like it. But we do have to stop, and we have to look this in the face and acknowledge that it was Frank Herbert who invented this genre without realizing it. And all of the fans of Frank Herbert also haven't realized it because the Venn diagram between people who read Dune and the people who read A Court of Fairies and Glitter are two separate circles. There's no overlap. No one would ever find out. The only reason that I found out is because I have had dealings with many middlingly literate women. And as a result, I am familiar with the smut that they enjoy. And I've said, okay, that sounds like a good book. But who am I to say? Because I'm here doing the same thing to you. And that's enough out of me for today. Thank you for tuning in to my self-immolation. It was nice running the BuckTube channel, but I'm sure I will lose all of the subscribers that I have gotten so far. However, the subscriber number just outpaced the number of videos. So this was a turning point. This was key for me in the development of the channel, which is why I have to burn it all down. It's a fear of success is what it is. It's the Thanatos impulse. It's pure self-destruction. But if you want to see me continue to burn and scream, go ahead and like, follow, subscribe if you haven't. And I'll catch you tomorrow in all likelihood. I'm going to be hitting this real hard these next couple of days because I have all this time off work. So I'm just going to be sitting around the house and powering through the last of the books that I need in order to make my 150 by the end of the year, so Goodreads isn't disappointed in me. Alright, thanks for tuning in. I love you. See you soon.